それをその人によって変わるのは当たり前。それが正しい正しくないとかありえないわけです。
個人的にはただその征服的禁止条約を分じるのを考えたらローラン成立だと早期に失礼と思うんですが、これがもっとさらにその、征服兵器が全般的なその安全性が突破の違いにすると、これあくまで物的に条約そのものに近づいていった場合
まあ、ご存知ですね。まあ、早期に一部しか親が見たんですけど、ありがたいです。あ、来ましたね。そうそうそう。一番何かじゃないですね。その国が、あの方がね、
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jin-Sop Jang, a representative of Harvard Kennedy School Korea Student Caucus. We established this caucus last year to enhance the understanding of Korean issues among the Harvard community. We are honored to host this event. In particular, we would like to acknowledge Dr. Kara, my mentor, for helping us for this great forum. Thank you, Dr. Kara, and his Secretary Gretchen. We believe North Korean issues are not only a matter of national security for 47 million South Koreans, but also a matter of addressing human rights for 22 million poor North Koreans. We also believe external and internal dynamics around Korea will affect the peace and stability of East Asia and the future of the world, whether positively or negatively, because the United States, China, Japan, and Russia are deeply involved in this region. Solutions will not simple in this multivariate situation. It is our great honor to invite distinguished panelists, and I hope all of you share this great discussion with these experts. In particular, we are proud to have our respected Dean Joseph Nye to serve as tonight's moderator. Though most of you know him, let me introduce our Dean briefly. The Kennedy School Dean Joseph Nye Jr. returned to Harvard in 1995 after serving as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and as chair of the National Intelligence Council. During his public service, he won 2 Distinguished Service Medals. He graduated Princeton University with summa cum laude, did postgraduate work at Oxford University on Rhodes Scholarship, and earned a PhD in political science from Harvard. As a member of the editorial board of Foreign Policy and International Security magazines, he is the author of numerous books and more than 100 articles in professional and policy journals. His most recent book is The Paradox of the American Power. When I was a strategic military planner of the South Korea, I read many times U.S. policy of East Asia, what is called the Nye Initiative, the naming after Dean Nye. Today, the Nye Initiative still provides a framework of U.S. strategies in East Asia. He is really a person who shaped Asia today. I think it is why he could not decline our invitation today. Please join me welcoming him with a big applause.
Thank you very much. Actually, the real reason I couldn't decline the invitation is because the subject is so fascinating. If you look at Korea, you have in South Korea one of the world's great success stories. And if you look at North Korea, you have one of the world's great failures. But these two countries, a great success and a great failure, are well, if you take Seoul to the DMZ, we're talking about 30 miles or so. And here you have in North Korea, you know, hundreds of thousands of troops lined up very close to the DMZ. And you have all sorts of concerns about nuclear weapons, missilery, and so forth. So you have an extraordinarily important situation in world politics. And that situation has recently been lumped together with other situations such as Iraq and Iran by President Bush with his comments about an axis of evil. So as if the problem on the Korean Peninsula was not difficult enough to begin with, it has now become even more sensitive in the way it has been lumped together in American rhetoric, at least, in these terminologies. So I think the fact that we have not only very distinguished Korean students here at the Kennedy School, but one of the world's most important problems, which has just recently been exemplified again, is good reason for this to be an important forum this evening. And fortunately, we have on this panel before you some of the best people you could want to be able to address the key questions. To my immediate left, Sung-Chul Yang is the South Korean ambassador to the UN, a very distinguished political science professor before he became a distinguished diplomat. Indeed, for 24 years, he's taught at places such as Kentucky and Northwestern and Indiana, as well as in Seoul. And the most important thing I should mention about him, which is that his daughter just graduated 3 years ago from the Kennedy School. John Tillelli, to his left, is president of Cyprus International, and he ended a distinguished 37-year career in the United States Army as Commander-in-Chief of the UN Command and the Republic of Korea and U.S. Forces, Combined Forces Command. So he was right there on the front line, so to speak. Charles Cartman is the Executive Director of the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, affectionately known as KEDO, and he was formerly the Special Envoy to the Korean Peace Talks. He has had a distinguished career in the State Department for 26 years, including being Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. And I said to him just before we came in here, I used to always read with fascination his cables of his latest discussion with the North Koreans, trying to make sense of what was going on. Dongbak Lee is an associate at the American Enterprise Institute this year in Washington. Before he was a member of the Korean National Assembly, where he served on the Unification, Foreign Affairs, and National Defense Committees. In the government, he was also the Director General of the North-South Dialogue Committee, so he knows a great deal about this subject. And finally, my friend and colleague Ash Carter, who is the Ford Foundation Professor of Science and International Affairs here at the Kennedy School, was across the hall from me in the Defense Department as Assistant Secretary of Defense between 93 and 96. And he became, after he returned to the Kennedy School, one of the world's great experts on Korean security issues because he worked with former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry in conducting the North Korean Policy Review, which stabilized for a period American policy toward North Korea. And I think he has some copies of the review over on a table back there if people want to see it. But that report, which involved travels to North Korea and South Korea and Japan, very intricate diplomacy, that report was a very important breakthrough in the later 1990s in terms of stabilizing our policy. So we have people who know a great deal about the subject and a very important subject. I think maybe what I'll do is we're not going to have people give little speeches. We're going to have a conversational style of which I'll ask some questions to get the subjects on the table, and then after that we'll turn to questions from the audience for the various panelists. But I'd like to start, first of all, with the immediate question before we turn to the longer run future. And that immediate question is, how grave is the crisis? is there a prospect of a crisis within the next year? Those of you who read the Financial Times may have seen a story last Friday which said that there probably would be a crisis within a year or so. Let me turn first to Ambassador Young and ask how great are the risks in the near term, in the year to come?
Well, let me just tell you that at this moment that there is a sign of hope because at this moment that President Kim Dae-jung's special envoy Im Dong-won is on the way to Pyongyang, and he will spend about 2 or 3 days, depending upon the progress of his talk with North Korean people. And he will go with President Kim Dae-jung's special letter to it. Well, I heard about those concerns about forthcoming crisis, but I must say that as a result of relentless and persistent pursuance of President Kim Dae-jung's sunshine policy, that tension level in Korean Peninsula is at an all-time low at the moment. But people talking about some kind of crisis coming next year because there will be a change of government in spring of next year, and Kim Jong-il of North Korea mentioned about the moratorium of missile test will be by year 2003, so maybe they're projecting it. But the important thing here is that we have plenty of time from now until then to work, prevent, preempt, and proact to prevent that kind of crisis.
John Tillelly, the North Korea is supposed to have nearly a million men under arms, and 60% of them, I think, within 100 kilometers of the demilitarized zone. Is there any chance that those troops could be used? Could there be a surprise attack? Or?
Well, I think that's a tough question. Could they be used? I think certainly is problematic. The issue is, will they be used? The fact is that the U.S. and ROC coalition is very strong. It's a very unique and a very good partnership. And the Mutual Defense Treaty, whereby we and the ROC armed forces are preeminent and have been for a long period of time in defending peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. And I think is one of the tenets, strength through the alliance is one of the tenets that has kept peace and security on the peninsula. The fact, I think, is not whether there will be a crisis. It's understanding what could cause a crisis on the peninsula. And there are many variables in that context, and certainly we can discuss those later during the question and answer period. Many variables, some mentioned by the ambassador, some that may be mentioned by Ambassador Cartman, that could cause a crisis on the peninsula, that could accelerate, and they're all levels of crisis. The fact is during my tenure from 96 to the end of 99, Ambassador Cartman and I and Secretary of Defense dealt with many crises, but they were low-level crises. So I think we have to define exactly what we're talking about.
Chuck, that throws the ball in your court, which is the under the arrangements of the Framework Agreement of '94, at some point as we approach the construction of the light water reactors, the nuclear reactors designed for electricity, before the critical nuclear equipment is transferred, North Korea is supposed to allow inspectors in to find out whether they really did cheat and make nuclear weapons in their non-electric generating nuclear facilities. Could that be something that would trigger a crisis?
Well, I can promise they're not going to get any reactors if they haven't done everything they're supposed to do. Right now, the speculation, which has been in the press, is about something called anticipatory breach, which makes me a little bit uncomfortable because nowhere in the agreed framework does one encounter such a term or even anything that comes close to it. The anticipatory breach in this case is that, well, if the inspections need to come before the key nuclear components of the reactors, then let's sort of play it out and see how long these inspections might take. And the IAEA, being a conservative organization, says, well, give us 3 or 4 years so we can do it right. You know, meaning, well, give us 1 or 2 years. But of course, being a bureaucracy, they stretch it out. So applying that 3 to 4 years to a possible construction schedule means that these inspections ought to be taking place right now. Well, nobody who negotiated the agreed framework had anything like that in mind. The concept of the agreed framework is that each side gives up its leverage gradually as confidence goes up. And so at some point a few years from now is the right time to talk about North Korea coming into full compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, presumably involving an inspection or two, but that's not really the term of art here.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Lee, we know that in a year there will be an election for a new president of South Korea. Imagine that the opposition party comes to power. What happens to the remains of President Kim Dae-jung's sunshine policy, and would that lead the North Koreans to, if it moves away from a sunshine policy, could that precipitate something by the North Koreans?
Well, we've been hearing the opposition figures in South Korea talking about it in the context that they're not necessarily against sunshine policy when it is found played out correctly. It relates to what kind of a version of sunshine policy we are talking about. That the opposition in Seoul has been saying that the sunshine policy in the version pursued under the leadership of President Kim Dae-jung was something which was not actually engaging North Korea. Rather it was turning out to be a policy of being engaged by North Korea. So they have been talking about correcting it, so much so that the sunshine policy can be played out correctly. Now, that was the major theme which was spoken about when the opposition leader Lee Hue-chang was in Washington the other time, that he talked about a stricter reciprocity, transparency, pragmatism, and national consensus. So I think even when we have a change in the government in Seoul, we are going to see sunshine policy right there. But the tone of the policy and the contents of the policy, the way the policy is played out, may differ from what had been pursued by President Kim's government.
Ash, Kim Jong-il has said that North Korea will observe a moratorium on testing of missiles through 2003, which is getting closer. And there's also some concern in the U.S. Congress about whether we should continue to fund the provision of heavy oil. Is it possible that in the next year or so that we would see Congress refusing to appropriate the necessary funds and Kim Jong-il resuming the testing of the Nodong missile and a crisis beginning that way?
Yeah, I'm not as sanguine, I must say, as some of the others about the next year, Joe. And you've pointed to, let's ask ourselves, what could the North Koreans do in the next year? Well, thing one you've just named, which is go out and launch another Taepodong long-range missile. That's what they did in 1998. That's what precipitated the last crisis, which led to the North Korea policy review with which I privileged to work. The time before that, in 1994, they were about to take the fuel out of their reactor at Yongbyon and process that fuel, in which case they would have gotten enough plutonium to make 5 or 6 nuclear weapons. That fuel's still there in Yongbyon. And anytime the North Koreans want to walk in there and start reprocessing the fuel, they have the capability to do so. And then, as John Tillelli knows better than anyone else, the first thing that Bill Perry and I did when we started the North Korea Policy Review was go and visit General Tillelli in his headquarters in Seoul and review the plan for the defense of South Korea against North Korea, which Major Jinsop Jang also participated in. That's a war plan that's been around for a long time, Op Plan 5027, and it calls for the United States and South Korea to confront those 1 million North Korean men who are at the DMZ and the 10,000 artillery tubes that are at the DMZ, hold them north of Seoul while reinforcements come in from the United States, by air and by sea. Hold north of Seoul because you don't want a modern city to change hands twice, and then move forward and destroy the North Korean armed forces. Now that's something I think John would say we're very confident we could do, and we could do in just a matter of weeks. But I got to tell you, the intensity of combat, if there's ever a war on the Korean Peninsula, would shock you all. It's not Desert Storm. This is a congested urban area, and all of our estimates were for many tens of thousands of deaths. I only say that, Joe, because you started with the axis of evil, and one of the problems I have with the phrase axis of evil, besides that it's a label rather than a strategy, is that it lumps together Iraq and North Korea, and they may both be deserving of the same label. But you know, we conduct airstrikes in Iraq on a regular basis. But in Korea, the stakes are much higher. This is not an open area where you simply conduct military operations without consequences. So I think it still remains a very, very dangerous area. We have to wait till there's a new election in South Korea and there's a new government, till the Bush administration decides on its own strategy. And the real question, Joe, is whether the North is willing to wait that long. They're masters at not being ignored.
What are they, yeah, John, go ahead, add on that.
If I could, I want to go back to the question on sunshine policy. I think in a historical context, we focus on engagement is only occurring during the sunshine policy. And the fact is there is a long history in the Republic of Korea to engage the North Koreans. And if you want to go back in the near term, you can look at the Arny Agreement of 91, 92, the baseline agreement, which was never adhered to. And certainly President Kim has taken a more aggressive and proactive approach in his description of the sunshine policy based on 3 tenets that he has portrayed. So in that view, I think we really constrain ourselves when we talk about engagement only in the context of the sunshine policy. It has been long going, it has been tried in different ways, and in a real sense, it has had a very fitful forward movement and backward movement.
Well, I'd like to add.
Chuck and then Mr. Lee.
I think Ash kind of put his finger on it, that in looking at the risk of some crisis, North Korea refuses to be ignored. They're not going to enter into a crisis in order to achieve their goals if there is some other route to do that. And during particularly the last year of the last administration in Washington, there was sufficient U.S. engagement with North Korea that problems looked as though, while still difficult, they could be solved through negotiation. There was, for instance, a moratorium on missile flight tests. There was a test of the agreed framework when we thought that they were constructing an underground nuclear facility that would have been the same one that we had frozen above ground, and that we thought maybe they had moved it below ground. We negotiated our way to achieve access to that facility to demonstrate that it wasn't what we had feared. And then, of course, the big test of diplomacy was finding out who you're making your deals with. And we never felt that we were hearing the leadership. And finally, the summit of June 2000 had Kim Jong-il come out and engage himself in this directly. And then he sent his envoy to Washington. We reciprocated with Madeleine Albright's visit. And things at that moment looked as though problems could be solved. And now here we are, over a year later, and we're talking about a possible crisis. And the only thing that's absent from the picture is all of that diplomatic engagement.
Mr. Lee, you want to jump in on that?
Well, we have been hearing some resurging talks about the heightened tension after President Bush's remark on, AOE stuff. But I'd like to make a couple of corrections in this regard. That I don't think a heightening of tension is resulting from President Bush's remark. North Korea has been there with the same kind of posturing all along. I don't think North Korea has been making a new, unprecedented posturing, bringing up the level of tension following the president's remark. That said, so much so that the scary scenarios that have been found, talked about on our side of the line, had very much to do what we create among ourselves, rather than having a lot to do with North Korea is found up to. That said, we have to be corrective on this, that the aversion of war on the Korean Peninsula has been due to more to the fact that we have been able to maintain the kind of credible deterrent mechanism in place in terms of the military alliance that we have been having between the two countries, rather than any reduced tension was the result of any policy. I mean, the sunshine policy or any engagement policy, at least as yet. So we should not confuse between the two. The sunshine policy or engagement policy, whatever that is, has yet to prove to be instrumental in bringing down the level of tension.
I wonder if I could, before we turn to the audience, raise a question about where we think we're going in the long run with North Korea. One of the things that strikes me is in the mid-1990s, there was a good deal of mistaken estimates, including my own, that said that if a country is starving 10% or more of its people, if it's seeing its GNP decline every year, if it's losing all its international allies, it's impossible that this can go on forever. And so some people said, we should engage North Korea, we should open up with them and so forth. And other people said, no, don't, because you're just going to prolong it. In other words, you should cut them off or isolate them because they're just on the brink of collapse. Well, as it turned out, that regime, even though it's a leftover from, if you want, a Stalinist era in some ways, has proved to be more resilient than many people expected, including me. I confess I was wrong on this. And I think the question is, if we look ahead now, how much longer can Kim Jong-il last? Some people say he has no alternatives because things just continue to get worse. Others say, yes, but when he has no alternatives, he may do something even riskier. And Ambassador Yang, as the South Korean ambassador to the United States, you have to talk to your American counterparts all the time. Is there any consensus between Seoul and Washington about how long Kim Jong-il will last? And
we don't talk about those long term.
But what's your own guess? I mean, will we see him there for another 10 years?
Well,
because I thought in 1990 I said not another 10 years. I was wrong.
I was wrong too, but well, I think in sort of examining North Korean situation, I was wrong that Kim Jong-il as a successor may not last long, but I thought the North Korean ruling regime or the North Korean system may last far longer than what we thought. But surprisingly that Kim Jong-il himself is taking care of North Korean system at the moment. So as you know, the sunshine policy or the engagement policy of President Kim Dae-jung and current government with an assumption that North Korea is no exception to communist China or Vietnam or Eastern Europe or former Soviet Union, that no matter how difficult and no matter how tough, peculiar it is, if we persist and if we continue this engagement, that North Korea too will someday become a member of the international community. It may take longer than Vietnam or China or other Eastern European countries, simply because of some peculiarities, such as Korea is still the last remnant of the Cold War. Unlike the other communist countries, son succeeded father, and which is a very peculiar to other systems. And all these peculiarities make North Korea harder to deal with or engage. But if we persist, that it will get some positive results. I respectively differ from Mr. Lee, who is my colleague when last time we were member of the Congress together. That is, Sunshine Policy made a tremendous success in all areas. Nobody believed that 427,000 South Koreans visited North Korean mountain, even though it's a confined, scenic mountain in North Korea, for the last 4 years. 427,000 South Koreans visited or toured that area. And all the previous years that the South Korean visitation to North Korea was less than 1,000. But for the last 4 years, in addition to these tourists, 22,000 South Koreans visited North Korea. These are engagement. And there was only one reunion of separated families in 1985. That's a one-shot separated family meeting during the Notae government. But for the last 4 years, some 3,700 reunion of families between North and South. And it's a tragedy because in South Korea alone, people who want to see their family members, separated family members in North is about 100,000. And they are all 70s, 80s, and 90s, and before they die, they want to see their family members. These are the real engagement. It's true, but that their military threat, weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, and all these other issues we have to deal with. But by engaging with other areas too, step by step, easier things first, then we eventually will resolve this problem. But the military solution, as most recent President Bush and President Kim Dae-jung summit in Seoul concluded, that we, as much as the United States concerned about the North Korean threat of weapons of mass destruction, but I think we have to first try through the dialogue and through the engagement. And it's very fortunate that both leaders agreed on that. And so this is the situation.
Ash, how long do you think the long run is? 10 more years?
I don't know a good answer to that, and I've never found anybody who had a good answer to that. I mean, logic would tell you that they just can't keep on keeping on with this sort of Stalinist throwback system. But I want to distinguish between making a prediction and a policy. When we did the policy review, we, as you wouldn't surprise you all to learn, one of the possibilities we considered was that it ought to be U.S. policy to get rid of the North Korean regime. And we studied that very hard, Joe, with your former colleagues. And I just have to tell you that you cannot find very much evidence at all by talking to North Korean defectors or observing what goes on in North Korea and so forth, that there is a nucleus of dissent upon which you could build there. All the defectors that have come out, I think Chuck will bear witness to that, have said they've acted alone. They were not part of any conspiracy. So there's no Iraqi National Congress there, and therefore we didn't feel that we could recommend to a president of the United States, here's a adopt as a strategy the changing of the administration in North Korea. Another possibility, which people suggest all the time, is that why don't you try to reform North Korea? Get them to change, open up, improve their economy, and so forth. Well, the fact of the matter is that the fundamental response of the North Korean system to that proposition is that it's not very distinguishable to them from the first idea. That is, they think that reform most likely means the demise of their system. So it's tough to go to an American president, Joe, and say it ought to be our strategy to affect the long-term destiny of the state of North Korea, whatever it is. And therefore, we came out in a different place, which is to say, and Mr. Lee said it very well a few minutes ago, deterrence is number one, that the North Koreans continue to believe that if they attack South Korea, we will destroy their armed forces and destroy their regime. They know we can do it and do it handily, but they know, we know, it's a bloodbath. And therefore, that fundamentally is the basis of stability on the Korean Peninsula now, and we've just got to keep on keeping on with that system as long as we can. That's where the missiles and the nukes get dangerous, because they could destabilize that deterrent situation. Otherwise, I think the best, what we fundamentally are looking at, Joe, for as long into the future as we can see, is a situation of mutual deterrence there on the peninsula, which is unsatisfactory but stable. And what's going to happen in the north, I don't know, but I don't know how to make a policy. I can make a prediction, but I don't know how to make a policy out of it.
Well, Mr. Lee, then Ambassador.
In talking about how long North Korea is going to last, as it is today, as it has been so far, very difficult to predict. But in discussing this matter, we have a number of undeniable, indisputable facts that we encounter. One, North Korea as a regime is anachronism. And it is something which has to do with whether or not North Korea can make itself an exception from the rest of the communist systems, as all the rest of communist systems have come down the road, down the drain, to their own demises. Now, in talking about North Korea, I think while we may be in support of some of the initiatives that we have for our policies toward North Korea, whether that is engagement or whatever, we must also take into account the need that we should not help North Korea as a regime to continue to remain as it is. People talk about North Korea induced to change, but the question is whether the present regime and present leadership is prone to the kind of changes or reforms that we desire to take place in that part of Korea. And one interesting anecdote that I have has this. You know, last August, last year, Kim Jong-il was in Moscow talking to Putin, coming up with what they call a Moscow Declaration. And that visit of Kim Jong-il to Moscow was followed by Jiang Zemin's visit to Pyongyang in September. And Jiang Zemin's visit to Pyongyang wound up without anything joint, no joint statement, which was very which raised a lot of curiosity. So I was in Beijing in October, November timeframe last year, talking to some CCP officials, leaders, and they were not answering that direct to my question about why there was not anything joint in an open manner. But informally, they had this answer. China wanted very much to have something joint because Jiang Zemin was obviously competing against Putin for influence in Pyongyang. But in the course of Jiang Zemin's visit in Pyongyang, China found that there was no way to arrive at an agreement, particularly because of three things. One, North Korea insisted in any joint statement that it has North Korea's own reference to the troop withdrawal issue. China was not in a position to accommodate that. And secondly, North Korea wanted to have a reference to North Korea's attack on US policy toward Korea. China was not prepared to accommodate that. And thirdly, while Jiang Zemin spent a lot of time talking about the virtues and benefits of Chinese reform and opening, hoping that North Korea would respond in kind. But North Korea was keeping on saying that while North Korea was appreciative of the accomplishments that China had made based on China's own policy of reform and opening, North Korea was going to stick with its own way of doing things. So China decided that there was no room for common grounds to put together in a joint statement. So they decided against coming up with anything joint, which, in my view, had so much to do with the inability of North Korean leadership to accommodate the kind of reform and opening and changes, which has to be factored into our observation of North Korea as a regime.
I want to hear from Ambassador Yang, General Jaleli, and Ambassador Cartman on the long-run question, and then we're going to throw it open to the audience for your questions and answers.
Well, let me just make two comments that we should distinguish opening from reform, because for the last 4 years, North Korea has opened up and established the diplomatic relations with 19 countries for the last 4 years, including 13 of EU members out of 15. Only France and Ireland didn't have a diplomatic relations with North Korea. So opening has been done. Only thing is reform has been very slow. And another point is that some people somehow misunderstood or thinking that engaging North Korea somehow relatively ignore or put less emphasis on the deterrence. But the sunshine policy, in essence, is the diplomacy and dialogue firmly based on deterrence. And deterrence, in essence, is the US-Korean alliance, which is the cornerstone of dialogue. So let me give you one incident. In 1998, June, there was a naval clashes between South Korean Navy against North Korean Navy, which encroached upon the North limit line. And it was the first naval battle between South Korea and North Korea since Korean War. And South Korea repulsed North Korean intrusion. And so South Korea, even though we are engaging with North Korea, that any military provocations or military encroachment upon South Korea, we are firmly responding with close coordination with the US troops in South Korea. So there is no misunderstanding that there shouldn't be any misunderstanding that the sunshine policy is somehow ignoring or underestimating the deterrence or defense posture.
John, what's your forecast for the future of North Korea?
First of all, I think the regime will be there much longer than any of us can imagine. I think they're very resilient. I pose these two questions rhetorically to you, and I will try to answer one and then leave the second one to you. What is the regime's primary responsibility as they view North Korea? And in my view, the regime's primary responsibility or goal is to preserve the regime. So if you believe that, which I happen to believe, you look at everything they do in that context. And when you talk about opening, you've got to look at how far a regime can open, that regime can open the door before there is too much light and the regime would, in fact, be affected. So in my view, there are accelerants, if you will, that could cause the regime not to survive, but I believe the regime will be there a very long time. I think Kim Jong-il believes that preservation of the regime is job number one, and he doesn't care whether or not the people starve, are malnourished, are diseased, receive any economic benefit. and he uses brinksmanship and coercive diplomacy to achieve the regime's goals.
Chuck, what's your forecast?
Well, being a diplomat, I'll try to come at this sideways, which is that first, a great deal of wisdom has emerged from my colleagues here. I can't say that I disagree with it, but I look at what are the challenges to long-term regime survival in the DPRK, and I myself feel that unlike what we used to think when we were all involved in diplomatic and policy sausage making, and it's not pretty, by the way. We all thought that collapse would be an implosion, that economic stresses would just cause this whole structure to just collapse in on itself. And now I suspect that if there's going to be a true challenge to the long-term health of the regime, it's going to come from the regime's attempts to control change. And we see a regime that is actually a lot more willing to take risks in this area than we would have thought. Starting with the summit with President Kim Dae-jung in 2000, we could never have imagined a summit between Korean leaders, but it happened. We could never imagine a DPRK regime willing to become dependent on foreign aid to feed its population, but it is now and is likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. We could not have imagined a regime that was willing to make a very comprehensive deal on missiles. I personally believe that the DPRK was willing to make such a deal. It unfortunately cannot be proven now. And there are many little signs out there. Kim Jong-il made a visit to Shanghai. He took with him a lot of his military leadership. That's what's known as a purpose visit. You know, why go to Shanghai and why bring that collection of military leaders? To show them that economic prosperity is a good thing and that they ought to get behind it, and to show everybody else that they were behind it. Why did Kim Jong-il send Jo Myung-nok to Washington as his special envoy? Here's the vice chairman of the National Defense Commission, to tell us in a way that, you know, even dumb Americans could not miss, that the DPRK military was going to stand behind whatever deal emerged. So this, to me, I have the feeling that this is a regime that is prepared to take risks to fix its problems. Right now, they have announced as policy that economic revitalization is a task equal to the Army First policy. Well, that's pretty interesting. We'll see what happens.
Well, thank you. We now have time for your questions. There are 2 microphones here on the floor, 2 in the balconies. And what I'd like you to do is to identify yourself
Back here.
and your relationship to the universities you asked your question. And it'd probably be useful if you would not only keep your question short, but address it to one of the panelists. If we have 5 answers to every question, we're probably not going to have very many questions. So identify yourself, ask a short question, and designate which panelist you would like to answer it.
Hi, my name is Robert Lim. I'm a senior at the undergrad, Harvard College. My question, let me just start off by saying, currently, North Korea, I actually cannot argue with George Bush calling an evil regime, considering that there are 22 million people living under oppression, 200 to 300,000 North Korean refugees in Manchuria.
No, we need a question. Okay. We don't need a speech.
So to the Korean ambassadors, is the ultimate goal of the Sunshine Policy the eventual reunification of Korea? And how do you reconcile the fact that the North Korean regime, the leaders there, will not, I mean, they have everything to lose from a unified Korea that in the end should be democratic and a capitalist society? How do you accommodate those leaders?
That's a tough question. Huh? Well, that's why we try to engage in one of the ingredient of engagement policy is gradualism, the piecemeal approach to North Korea, so that by gradually engaging with each other, then we can reconcile, not only reconcile the differences, but also improve the relations by the either economic conditions or political situations or social situations. That it will take a long time. So there is no immediate absorption of the North by South Korea. That's the long-term goal we have, yes. Speaking of the refugees, that recently there was 25 North Korean refugees stormed into a Spanish embassy in Beijing. That happened, but remember that before President Kim Dae-jung's government came in 1998, that the North Korean refugees entering into South was about 58, but last year was 587. So sometimes quiet, persistent diplomacy is better to rescue those refugees than some, one-shot, lots of publicity seeking.
If a panelist disagrees with an answer, you should jump in. It's just, we don't have to have 5 answers, but another point of view on an answer is fine.
I'd like to say that Robert has really illuminated something very important, which is that if you believe deep down that the DPRK is an evil regime, and what 2 political words could we find that are worse than axis and evil, then what business do you have negotiating with them? That's sort of the guts of what you are getting at. And of course, Ambassador Yang, and I would associate myself with Ambassador Yang, believe that jaw is better than war. And as a negotiator, I kind of cringe when my leaders use overheated rhetoric to get in the way of my negotiation. But I guess President Bush was, I think he's got some genuine issues with the DPRK, and he was speaking more or less from the heart. So I'd say it's not yet resolved what it is we want to do.
In the balcony.
Reg McKean, Institute for Learning and Retirement. I think Joe Nye's next question might well have been, would any member of the panel make any changes in the present Bush administration policy toward North Korea? And I'd be grateful for any help from any panelist.
I'd hire me.
To do what specifically policy-wise?
Well, since Ash helped to design the prior administration's policy, you should take a crack at that.
Well, I think the first thing that needs to be said about the Bush administration's policy, leaving aside the axis of evil speech, which, as I said, I don't find helpful to make a label in place of a strategy, but fundamentally, I don't think they've gotten around yet to reviewing the situation and coming up with their own policy. I mean, after all, they are
After 15 months in office?
Let me just say, they came in, they had a transition. I lived through a transition, and it's easy to believe that they didn't know what of their mind about every issue around the world right off the bat. Then came September 11th, preoccupied with other things. So I don't think we've seen a considered Bush administration policy yet. I believe that they will, when they look at the situation, follow the logic that seems plausible to me, which is, I don't know a way to get rid of North Korea, to wave a wand, make them reform, make them go away, make them reunify. They're there. They have 1 million men on the DMZ who can do a lot of damage, and even though we'll destroy them if they do it, it's a lot of damage in the meantime. And therefore, my primary interest, and I think they will conclude their primary interest, is in keeping stability in this situation and making sure that that war doesn't happen, and that by acquiring nuclear weapons or ballistic missiles, North Korea never believes that it has tipped that deterrent balance in some way, and that the best way to keep them from getting nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles is to engage with them, talk with them. It doesn't mean give them things, but continue to deal with them And as far as the long-term future is concerned, we don't have any real way, any leverage on that, any way of influencing. I believe, therefore, the Bush administration, following that logic, will come back essentially to that point sometime next year after there's a new ROK government with which it can partner, because no American strategy can succeed in the Korean Peninsula unless it's an American strategy together with the ROK. We'll have a new government next year. I think the Bush administration, predict that that's where they'll come out. My concern is we got a whole year to get through before we get there, and I just hope the North Koreans can keep their shirts on that long.
I don't think I find it easy to speak for a Bush administration policy, myself being a transient outsider in residence momentarily in the States. But even with the AOE remark, I don't think President Bush was necessarily speaking against having any truck with North Korea. I think what he said in his State of Union speech and some subsequent remarks, what he was saying was trying to reorient, restructure, reorder some of the priorities in dealing with North Korea. And I think this administration is, in my view, committed to making sure that from now on, a policy will be undertaken engaging North Korea rather than being engaged by North Korea. And I think that is what had been put together in the context of what President Bush said in his June 6th statement last year. So I'd rather see that I think this administration here in Washington is going to continue to remain committed to the idea of keeping on engaging North Korea, rather on U.S. terms, rather than on North Korean terms. That is, in my view, some kind of a difference. And that difference has something to do with the kind of criticism that some of the past policies toward North Korea were to a certain extent somewhat off the mark and off the track. So that is the way I'm feeling of the policies posturing coming from Washington.
John?
I don't disagree with either Mr. Lee or Ash Carter, but I would say in a real sense, as you look at the North Korean policy review, that's exactly what the intent was. Engagement on the terms of the United States in a path of good, which was tangible results as a function of tangible or reciprocity, or back to the future, which is containment, deterrence, and where we are today. And that was a very collaborative effort, and I think, in my heart of hearts, I think that Dr. Perry and his team set the base plate for many of the things that occurred positively, because it was collaborative. It was collaborative between the United States, the Republic of Korea, and Japan. So in my view, that base plate still has coherence and in the context of Mr. Lee's discussion, I think relevance today as we go to the future.
My name is Yoo Jong-sung. I'm a doctoral student at the Kennedy School of Government. I'm from Korea. First, with regard to the question of Dean Nai's question of how long North Korean regime will last, I have been never wrong. I never predicted North Korean regime would collapse soon. Not because I thought North regime is very good, not because they are, but when a country is under the threat, in the face of a very biggest military power in the world, then the people, their first priority is not their own internal problems. Their first priority is their defense against the exterior threat. So that's the biggest secret of the stability of North Korean regime. What do you think about my opinion? In that regard, I think President Bush has contributed greatly to the stability of North Korean Kim Jong-il's regime. Even in the United States, since the September 11th, George Bush is happy, even if it was not the intention of the terrorists. So that's an irony. And with regard to that, I think the deterrence issue is changing. According to a recent poll in the South Korea, over 70% of the people disagreed with the labeling of axis of evil, President Bush's labeling of North Korea as an axis of evil. Why most of Koreans don't agree with President Bush's labeling? Because, is it because they think North Korean regime is good, or is it because the priority issue of deterrence is not the military attack from North Korea, but our very concern about the possible military action from United States?
So does, if I could simplify the question, does a tough rhetoric by the United States actually help Kim Jong-il to survive? Who would like to try that? Mr. Lee.
I'd rather disagree with that. Actually, the security threat talked about by North Korea is North Korea's own making. If you look into the historical background of the Korean question, I don't think you can come up with the feeling that those threats had their origins down south, including the Republic of Korea and the United States. So the threat scenario has all along been North Korea's own making as a means to secure their own political security, regime security. So we don't have to be swayed by that type of scenario which originates in Pyongyang. So one of the negative spillover of the Sunshine Policy, although I find it rather difficult to disagree with my esteemed colleague, Ambassador Yang, but one of the negative aspects of the Sunshine Policy was that policy has helped the people to be misled, particularly about the security aspect of that we have. That the security has been in place. I mean, reductions of tensions and aversion of war had been caused by the Sunshine Policy. I don't think that is the case. And that is something which has been appealing to quite a large number of people during the last several years, to the extent that many people are now found pretty much misled about that particular aspect.
Ash, you wanted to comment?
Well, I was going to give, this is only half jocular, but when you get in the North Korea business, you need to be very thick-skinned about rhetoric. And yes, President Bush called North Korea the axis of evil, but the North Koreans in the weeks subsequently have said that President Bush has moral leprosy, and worse, I'm sure much worse to him, said that he should behave more like Bill Clinton. So I found long ago when I first started to deal with North Korea that you have to correct a lot for the rhetoric. I don't think that the North Koreans take the axis of evil rhetoric so seriously. I think what would be interpreted by North Korea as a serious breach would be if the administration withdrew its offer, which let's remember is on the table, to meet with the North Koreans anytime, any place, no preconditions. That's the key thing to the North Koreans, that the door's open to them, that they can talk. That is the new administration's position, and I think that looms a lot larger than the North, than any slogan that may loom large to us. Yes.
My name is Jacques Pellet. I'm a fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. To come back to the question why the North Korea regime lasts so long, isn't it also because perhaps there is a high level of consensus for a status quo among the players I mentioned, Russia, China, the US, and Japan? And when you are not a specialist of the question of Korean Peninsula, it's very hard to find any good reason for dramatic change and for reunification for those players. And just to add that as a weak North Korea is as dangerous as a strong North Korea, we maintain, low-level crisis. I don't know.
So if all the neighbors want Korea Peninsula to stay divided, does that explain why we have a long-lasting North Korea? Chuck, or what do you think?
Well, it doesn't hurt. But although I think the point is accurate, that is, there is a certain comfort from stability that the present situation contains, I'm not sure that it can be demonstrated as a genuine factor in keeping North Korea as it is. It might be, to the contrary, that when we look at the events of 2000, when the regime made a very important decision to move on to a summit with Kim Dae-jung, and presumably they made a decision simultaneously to move into some sort of a negotiation with the US. That was a decision that was quite fundamental for that regime. And it's not, we are not where we are today because all of the surrounding countries wanted that effort to fail, but only because the political calendar ran out.
But,
Left back, oh, sorry, John, go ahead.
But at the same time, I think as you put your question in the context of the region, you also have to put in the context the past of what occurred. There was opportunity as part of the four-party talks where there were players who were truly trying to have a genuine opportunity for a lasting peace treaty instead of the truce that we are currently enjoying, if you can use that term, in Korea. So there have been opportunities, and there have been opportunities that have been coordinated and collaborated with throughout the region. Now, you're trying to get into the brain cells of those regional actors and trying to describe what they may or may not think, but there have been opportunities to truly come up with a lasting peace that have been fitful in their success or failure.
Left balcony.
My name is Do-hyun Chung. I'm a first-year student at the MPI ID program. And my question is for Ambassador Yang, but I will appreciate any other comments from other distinguished panelists. I heard from one of my fellow students here at the Kennedy School a very striking view, but also very intriguing, and that fellow student is actually a wholehearted supporter of President Kim Dae-jung, and I believe he wants to go anonymous. But that view was about sunshine policy, whether it would bring about unification in the short term or not. And he believes that Kim Dae-jung is so wise that he doesn't want any immediate unification. And actually about, I think a few years ago, before Kim Dae-jung inaugurated, North Korea had several years of successive drought and was near collapse by anyone's standard. However, Kim Dae-jung, he believes that Kim Dae-jung thought that the immediate collapse of North Korea will actually create more crisis and risk in the Korean Peninsula. So by having sunshine policy, it can actually help Kim Jong-il's regime to stay longer. so that it will bring more stability in Korean peninsula. So I mean, that was pretty striking, and I was very surprised because most Koreans believe that sunshine policy will bring about unification. That's what the Kim Dae-jung government has been advertising. So, well, either way, I think there is some merit and some good thoughts. So I'm just wondering about what is the true intention of the sunshine policy.
Ambassador Yang, what do you think of that?
Well, as I said earlier, that the sunshine policy is a gradual, long-term policy. And if I can make it clear, then there are 3 stages. In the beginning, you want to reconcile each other and cooperate each other and reduce mutual distrust and mistrust between the 2 halves. And then if you reach that stage, then you can engage further into other areas of differences. And then eventually, the unification and thing will be the long-term goal. So I don't think that there is an old Chinese saying that what are the 3 vital functions of government? Sufficiency of food, sufficiency of defense, and people's confidence in the government. But whether North Korea is starving or not, that's not sufficient condition for immediate collapse. So I don't think President Kim tried to, or policy tried to sustain North Korean government by giving food and other aids. No, that's a kind of conspiracy theory, isn't it?
Ash, a quick point.
Well, I don't think, I think these last 2 questions are touching upon something very fundamental. I don't think it prolongs the North Korean regime, which has its own ways of prolonging itself. But the fact of the matter is that all of the major powers in the region, China, the United States, Japan, and South Korea, are not dissatisfied with the situation that now exists on the Korean Peninsula. If you're South Korean and you contemplate absorbing 22 million incredibly impoverished people into your economy, that's not like East Germany and West Germany. The population bulk in North Korea relative to South Korea is much larger. The income disparity is much greater. That would be a huge burden to South Korea. A lot of South Koreans wish their brethren in the North well, but aren't necessarily prepared to pay their bills. The United States has 37,000 troops, yes, in South Korea. On the other hand, it's our policy to keep them there. And we think that's a good thing for our interests. Moreover, the South Korean government agrees with that. Moreover, the Japanese government agrees with that. Maybe even some parts of the Chinese government agree with that. And the Chinese, for their part, the one thing they don't like is trouble on the Korean Peninsula because, among other things, it brings the Americans in with their hair on fire, and they don't like that. So everybody nobody can think of a way of improving upon this situation, though everyone can think of a way of improving upon North Korea. That's the basic issue, or basic situation.
We obviously could continue well into the evening. There are many questions left, but we're subject to the tyranny of the airlines. Some of our panelists have to return to New York, Washington, and other such places. But I think we've been able to raise a number of interesting points on a fascinating topic. And please join me in thanking the panelists for coming to the Kennedy School tonight.
Very good. Thank you.
Good to see you again.
Very much.